In the last lecture, we had a look at string interpolation, which is a great tool for outputting data in a template. Now I want to have a look at property binding. Now, one important information right away, there are a lot of times where you can either use property binding or string interpolation. And I will show what I mean in a second. Let's go to our servers component where we manage all the servers. And I want to allow the user to add new servers. At least soon I want to allow that. So we will need a button where I say add server on it, and I will just add some CSS classes button and button primary to make this button look nice. This is all using normal Bootstrap CSS classes though, nothing to do with Angular. And to reflect this change in my servers component here, I also want to comment out the inline template and point to the external template again. So template URL should point to my servers component .html file like this. So now with this, if I save this, we see that button here. Right now, it doesn't make any sense that I'm able to click this button because it doesn't do anything. We haven't learned to react to a button click yet. So I will add a new property in my TypeScript code here, which I'll name allow new server and set it to false. So now this is also another property holding a Boolean value. So true or false, in this case false, because I don't want to allow the user to create a new server. And you could again imagine that this is somehow derived dynamically. We will soon work with some dynamic data. So in the HTML file here, I now want to disable the button. And as you probably know, there is a disabled attribute you can add, like this. If we now save this, the button is disabled, I can't click it. That's nice, but that's hard-coded into HTML. Now maybe this allow new server code here changes, however. Maybe it's not set to this all the time. So then we wouldn't be able to react to this. And I can actually demonstrate this by, for now, in the constructor, which is simply a method executed at the point of time this component is created by Angular. By there, calling setTimeout, a normal JavaScript function. And here I define after which period of time or after how many milliseconds something should happen. So after 2000 milliseconds, which are 2 seconds, I want to execute a function. And here I'm using an ES6 arrow function. This syntax might look strange. It's almost the same as function like this, with some differences when it comes to handling the this keyword. But in the end, here you pass the arguments and here you have the function body. More importantly, in here, I can set allow a new server, and now this would not work in the other syntax because this would then be referring to something else, can set it to true. So after 2 seconds, this will be switched to true, and since we hard-coded this, of course this doesn't affect our button here at all. It stays disabled. So I want to bind it to allow a new server. So now to make this disabled functionality dynamic, we can bind to it by enclosing it in square brackets. Square brackets indicate to Angular that we're using property binding, that we want to dynamically bind some property, and disabled, the HTML attribute, in the end, in normal HTML, only sets a specific property on the underlying DOM element. You might know that each HTML element you use is parsed by the browser and kind of translated into an element on the document object model. This is totally unrelated to Angular. And therefore we have an element in this DOM, and this element has a couple of properties. A lot of these can't even be set through attributes on the HTML element. Well, one of the properties is the disabled property, and you can set it through the disabled attribute, but here we're not using the disabled attribute anymore. With these squared brackets, we are directly binding to this native disabled property this HTML element has. So now we can set this equal to, and now between the quotation marks here, an expression which for this property resolves to a Boolean, but for other properties another type might be required. Because again, you can bind to a lot of properties, basically to all the HTML element properties. We'll soon learn that there are also other properties you can bind to. So for now I can simply pass allow new server here, my property name, because this will resolve to true or false, exactly the value the disabled the property needs because it has to decide whether it should be disabled or not. So now with that, if we reverse this, so by adding an exclamation mark, we made sure that this is only disabled if this is false. So if allow new server is not true, otherwise we would do exactly the opposite. So now with the exclamation mark, if we go back to the app, you see it's disabled, but after 2 seconds, let me reload this, it becomes enabled. Because now we're binding to this disabled property, this native element property, we're binding this to our own TypeScript property here. And the convenient thing is, and this is what Angular is all about, that this will update dynamically. So once allow new server changes, this is changed in the DOM, so now the button gets enabled. One of the main reasons why you use Angular, it makes it very easy for you to interact with your DOM to change some things there at runtime like we do here. That is property binding in place. Now, as I mentioned, besides binding to HTML element properties like we do here, you can also bind to other properties, for example of directives, something we haven't learned about yet, and your own components, something I will also show you later. So this is property binding. Before moving on to the other two forms of data binding, let's find out where you could actually use string interpolation instead of property binding. In the last lecture, we learned about property binding. Now, if we had the use case that we also want to output the current value of allow new server, we could of course use string interpolation to simply output allow new server, and a boolean can also be cast into a string. So now we see false here, and after 2 seconds you see this change to true because we changed it in the code. Nice. Now this is one of the cases here where you can easily use property binding instead of string interpolation. So you could simply bind to a property of this element, the inner text property, and set this equal to allow new server. Now I can remove the string interpolation here inside of the tags, and whilst they might look empty now, well, we set the inner text so we get the same behavior as before, because the inner text property of an element is just what's between the opening and closing tag. So in this case, we were able to easily replace string interpolation with property binding. So when should you use which of the two? Well, basically, if you want to output something in your template, print some text to it, use string interpolation. If you want to change some property, be that of a HTML element or, as you will later learn, of a directive or a component, typically use property binding. That is how you can differentiate it, and you will get a feeling for this once you work your way through the course project and so on. So this. One important note I want to make is don't mix property binding and string interpolation. You might notice that here we have disabled equals and then we have quotation marks and then directly our property name. There are no curly braces between these quotation marks, and there shouldn't be, because that will break the app. This will not work. Between the quotation marks of property binding, you can and you must already write TypeScript code, so to say, a TypeScript expression which will return the value this property expects. So for disabled, some expression which returns true or false. So just like with string interpolation, you may also call a method there, but you must not add curly braces in there. Whilst it might look we simply use a HTML attribute there, we aren't. This whole syntax here is a syntax recognized by Angular. So this is why between the quotation marks you can already, and you have to write TypeScript code, because again, this whole expression is evaluated by Angular. Mixing in string interpolation will break it. String interpolation only works in a normal template, not within another expression of that template, not within property binding or something like this. With that, enough about property binding and generally about outputting data in the template. Let's see how we can react to events. In the last lectures, we learned a lot about how we can use property binding and string interpolation to output data in the template. Let's now react to events. For example, we have a button here, and after 2 seconds this button is enabled, so it would be nice if we could do something once we click the button. Now, I will soon show you how we can actually add a new server, how we can add a new replication of our server selector, of our server component here. For now, what I want to do is, I want to output something. I will remove this text here, and instead here, I want to output the value of a property. I'll create this property, and again, you may ignore ng-on-init for now. I will come back to this. I will name it server creation status, and initially I will set it to no server was created, like this. Now this property can be output via string interpolation, server creation status. And I just told you I don't want to continue outputting data, we want to listen to events. So I promised it, we'll do it. I will add another method below here, and I will name this method onCreateServer. The on at the beginning to kind of make clear that this will be triggered from within my template. You don't have to name it on something, but it kind of makes it easier to understand who will call this method. Well, the user will basically by doing something. Some event will call it. That is what I want to symbolize with that. So in here I will set the server creation status to server was created. So the missing piece of course is to call this method, and now here is where event binding comes into play. We want to listen to this click event here, and typically you have the onClick attribute on the HTML element where you can now execute some JavaScript code. We won't use that with Angular though. Here we have the syntax Angular offers us event binding, which uses parentheses, like property binding used squared brackets. For events, parentheses are the signal that we're using event binding. And here we have to specify the name of the event between the parentheses. For example, click. And you can basically bind to all the events made available by the HTML attribute you're placing this on. So if you have onClick, on mouse enter, you could bind to click mouse enter without the on at the beginning. So we bind to the click event, and now between the quotation marks, we put the code we want to execute once this event occurs. Now, oftentimes you will call a method here. So let's do this. Let's point to the method we want to execute, which is onCreateServer with parentheses. So this method will now get executed whenever we click the button. As a side note, you don't have to execute a method here. You could also put the code you want to execute right between the quotation marks. Oftentimes, this is not very good because you want to execute more code if some event happens. But if all you want to do is set some Boolean property to true, for example, well, you can definitely do this inline the template. As a general rule, though, you shouldn't put too much logic into your templates, though. So now we're binding the click event, and we execute the onCreateServer method when it occurs. So let's see this in action. In our application, let's reload the page. The button gets enabled, and now watch this part here. If I click the button, it changes to server was created because we are triggering our own method here. And this is how simple event binding works. Use parentheses, the event name in between, and then between the quotation marks, the code you want to execute when this event occurs.